Warm welcome to this Uptech. I am happy to be hosting this together with my colleagues. I'm Sarah. I'm the CEO of Softhouse. And if we take the next slide, there we can see that Softhouse, we are the down-to-earth experts in software projects. We are the creative power of the design process, often together with Milou, that will present herself and Milou just after me, and also an accelerator for software-intensive products companies. So, as you see, we have the chat going on where we have shared where we are. Where are Softhouse? The next slide is here you can find us. We are up in Luleå, and I saw a couple of people joining in from Luleå. Don't know if someone is here from Sarajevo, but we also have an office in Sarajevo, and we have 8 other offices across the in the Sweden country. So that is where you can find us if you want to stop by and say hi. Again, you're warm welcome to this conversation, this session today. And a couple of you have already gotten to know the chat function. If not yet, then feel free. It is there during the whole session. And of course, also the unmute button. If you want to raise a question in any way, I know that also the presenters will welcome that as they start their presentation. And this is what we will talk about today. Accessibility. And Josephine, you will share some important stuff about that, since many things are happening within that area. And then it is my pleasure to again introduce you, Joe, as our key speaker, talking about engineering this day. And then we can have a Q&A, and we can have that also along the way during the presentation. So let's do this now. Josan, I give you the word.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so my name is Josephine Rennemark. I work as an art director and UX designer at Milou Communication, as Sarah mentioned. We work a lot with accessibility. And today I thought I would give a short introductory talk about the highly relevant topic, as there is a new directive that's approaching next year, meaning that more companies will have to meet the standards of accessibility, not only those in the public sector. But to start off, I would like you to first imagine the digital world as a city. So, you know, it has all the fun stuff that we want to visit, take part in, and also the things we need. So a lot of streets are filled with obstacles and dead ends. And for some, navigating this is easier, but for a lot of people, it's a constant struggle. So our goal when working with the user experience and accessibility is to ensure that every street is open and navigable for everyone, because accessibility also means inclusion and the ability for all individuals to participate. You can slide there. So disabilities, they happen to everyone now and then. It could be situational, meaning that the situation you're in disables you, like having the sun in your eyes and not seeing the screen properly, or being in a crowded, noisy place, having a hard time to focus. Or it's a temporary disability, if you've been skiing and you've broken your dominant hand. Well, maybe you've helped an older individual carry out a task on their phone or computer. Disabilities are more common in this user group, and they often have less computer experience as well. So something that's obvious to you might not be for a person with limited computer experience or a cognitive disability. And it's actually around 20 people of the global population that have some form of permanent disability. So that's over 1 billion people worldwide. So we're talking about a lot of people who also want to access the web if we make it possible for them to do so. So WCAG, maybe you've heard of it, stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And it's their standards we often measure our accessibility to. So the standards are based on 4 basic principles. So you can always ask yourself, can the user perceive the information? Can they operate the functionality? Can they understand it? And is the solution robust and reliable? Well, if we go to the next slide, we can see that there are a lot of different aspects and types of disabilities to consider. So these posters from the UK Home Office, they summarize it in a great way. As you can see, they provide some do's and don'ts and divide it into 6 different categories of users, like users of screen readers, users with dyslexia, and so on. So if you want to learn more, I highly recommend starting with these, as they are a good source. And next slide. Some of you may have heard about the DOS law, or DOS-lagen, as we say in Swedish. And it applies to entities in the public sector. Well, a new law will come into effect next year that expands regulations to include products and services on the consumer market as well. So this means that from June 2025, a lot more companies must meet the European accessibility standard. It's called EN 301549, and it includes WCAG 2.1. And there are some exceptions, though, such as smaller business with fewer than 10 employees and such. But to learn more about this, a great resource is digin.nu. And they summarize this in a really good way, pedagogically. I don't know the word. But if we go to... so it would require a lot more time. It can be added later. Maybe you've heard this said sometime, or you've said it yourself. Well, if we go to the next slide, we can actually see a clear increase in cost and effort the longer into the process we wait with our accessibility efforts. There's a term that's called shift left, and it means the practice of moving certain aspects of the development process to earlier stages in the timeline to ensure a more cost-effective way of working. Well, this applies to accessibility efforts as well, as it should not be an isolated phase or handled too late into the process. So it's really, really important that we identify and deal with potential issues or requirements early on and continue to work with them throughout the process. It's actually estimated to be around 5 times more costly to address the accessibility issues when we're in the development phase, and up to 30 times more costly when we handle it when the solution is already in production. So accessibility is not a feature. It's a social right. It's about creating spaces where everyone can participate and where everyone can thrive. So just to summarize a short speech, allocate extra time in the design phase to identify and address accessibility requirements early on. Make accessibility a recurring item on the agenda so that it's not forgotten or overshadowed by other priorities. And get educated, and remember that the accessibility requirements are evolving, so keep updated with the latest guidelines. Thank you. Really quick.
Thank you, Josephine. And don't get stressed up when you hear this. There are people to help, friendly hands that you can grab. So don't be a stranger if you want to understand more.
And we at Milou can actually help to create accessibility reports and such if we want to.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And you will, of course, stick around for the full hour. So if any questions, not now, maybe they will come later. So thanks again, Josephine. And again, it is my pleasure to, Joe, ask you up on the stage.
Tack.
So,
I'll just stop the presentation. Okay. Do you see that?
We do.
Great. Okay, cool. So I want to talk about building experiences. And to give you a bit of context, I used to be in design and product development, and I spent a lot of time doing digital work. I was at Nokia for many years, and then I was head of design at a company called Us2, which we done apps for all sorts of businesses, from H&M to Vans and the North Face and all sorts of companies. And in that time I'd been working, I became interested in endings as an experience in terms of closure, a closure experience. I left these businesses and then I swapped sort of roles with my wife, and then I was sort of interested in digging into this issue, which I thought wasn't going to last very long. This is now 10 years later, and I started to dig into it, and this issue just sort of exploded in my mind. It was so fascinating. I thought I had to share it with people. I ended up writing the first book, which is the Ends book, which came out in 2017, and the more recent one, Engineering, came out in a couple of years ago. But now I'm an evangelist about endings, and I want to share that with you and why it's super important. So this is so I'm going to give you that talk. Okay, cool. Thank you very much. In the consumer life cycle, we can break it down into 3 sections: onboarding, usage, and offboarding. And what we tend to do in businesses is create structure around the onboarding phases and the usage phases, attracting the customer along with through marketing and advertising, giving purpose, and then having framing and gates around that, so that as they graduate into the consumer experience, the usage period, and that's very controlled, thought about and thought through. And within that, then we put emotion and purpose through branding, identity and experiences, and these have been developed over many decades, even centuries, and they're very powerful experiences for the consumer. We don't, however, tend to do this at the end of the consumer life cycle. The whole situation at the end changes. It's a different audience, it's a different voice, it's a different group organizing it. These are cold, emotionless endings. Often we use the sort of the leverage of shame and guilt, which are very old, brutal tools to use on people. And the purpose of that often ends up in rather poor places like waste, landfill, data lakes without purpose. And this end gap at the end of the consumer life cycle is the problem space. And within this problem space, we have 4 problem characteristics. The first one is that the relationship breaks. That's the relationship which was so precious at the beginning of the consumer life cycle. That relationship then breaks, and the assets from that relationship then fall to the feet of society and into the environment, whether that be physical, digital, or service environment. The second one is the asset definition is lost. And when you buy something, you are all about the asset definition. It's a size 8 pair of shoes, a size 12 dress, a 16 megapixel camera, a 2-liter engine. All of these things are the definition of your purchase and choice. But at the end, we tend to fall these things into the sort of the waste stream, and then they become really hard to interrogate in the waste stream. And this also happens in data, where we merge databases, create data lakes, which are also really hard to interrogate. The third one is actors and actions are anonymized. So at the beginning of the consumer life cycle, I'm identified as a consumer on many different levels, whether that be through my banking credentials, some sort of loyalty scheme, even more subversive things like taking facial recognition stuff. At the end of the consumer life cycle, I'm anonymized. I disappear from any the impact that I make, and that is anonymized from any relationship to me. In a data sense, though, it changes. It's the perception from the user is that when I delete my app, my data's deleted. But this actually often gets merged into a sort of shadow world and reassembled and becomes purposeful in another dimension, as it were. And the last one is routes to neutralizing a blurred. And what this means is that when, for example, I consume an apple, I'm pretty confident that if I throw that away into the natural environment, it will decay and I'll be able to just walk away from that. It's fine. But as soon as I have something maybe human-made, a plastic bag, for example, I have doubts about how does this get neutralized. And of course, that is the same with data as well. If I delete something, where has it been deleted from? And I'm sure all of us have experienced the cloud services when you delete it on your computer and then it asks, should I delete this everywhere? And I'm thinking, where is everywhere? So these 4 things then lay the foundations for the problem space of what we're trying to challenge with engineering. And so I'll just talk a little bit about what engineering is. So this space here, what we're trying to do is fill this with the same actors, techniques and purpose that we've created elsewhere in the consumer life cycle. We try to bond the consumer and provider together in a mutual responsibility to deal with the problem. And then with that, we can be far more accurate in building value at the end, protecting brand equity, reclaiming materials, doing proper data erasure or cleaning, and capture to reverse logistics. When I work with businesses, one of the biggest parts of that is getting people to just be present at the end, building vocabulary and skill sets. It's like flexing a muscle. We're actually incredibly good at having meetings about onboarding, and any one of us probably on this call have been super comfortable in any meeting talking about onboarding and usage periods of their product. So when I do sessions about offboarding, it's incredible how clumsy we are and how hard we find just to be present at the end and think about the context that the consumer deals with. The tools that I've developed around this help identify definition in endings. There's 8 types of endings the consumer generally experiences in offboarding, and these can range from timeout, periodical endings, or cultural endings, which are very nuanced, like fashion. We'll come back to some of these, and also that periodic time of moving through a narrative from usage to the end is really important. Narrative is a really powerful tool for many consumers and humans to see purpose and show how things are progressing. And we don't use this enough in the offboarding of consumer experiences. I'll come back again to this one later as well. So let's put this in the context of digital a bit more. With consumer experiences of data. Now, humans have pretty good, obviously, for many centuries and thousands of years of recognizing an object in place. So, for example, if you have a chair in your house and you don't like that chair, it's physically there all the time, reminding you to get rid of it or do something with it. And so that physical presence is there, it's reminding you, it's purposeful until you deal with it. There's different things at endings. So, for example, services which get periodically visited, they become periodically visible. Often your bank accounts, you'll notice that, oh, I'm still paying for this subscription. Why am I still paying for this subscription on your monthly banking statements? With digital, when we're in a digital relationship, we can often access that digital relationship and what's going on in it to see what data is going on through getting onto the app and dealing with it there, and we can see that there. And then there's another place which is like what's happened after that digital stuff, which is really unknown to the consumer, over the horizon. And this is the worst type of lingering ending types. Part of this is the way that we've built consumer experiences. We've spent a lot of time like attracting customers and building products, and that's also been compounded by the way that we've built the whole sector in terms of quick startup type of approaches. In the aftermath, we haven't thought that through so much, and we have the visibility is very clouded for the consumer. We've pulled in lots of legislation that I'll come back to later. Some of this emerges from the different types of relationship you have with your data and the data providers. So, for example, a trusted relationship will be a more walled garden relationship. That's more like banking. And then we're getting more symmetrical relationships with one provider. So, for example, I might sign up directly with my email address with Wired. More recently, which has been really useful, this is the proxy and OAuth relationships. Those have been allowed us to have sort of empowerment and sign up to things by a trusted party. And there's many relationships that have sort of dissipated and haven't been closed properly, and these end up in these sort of invisible asymmetrical relationships, which you don't quite know where the data's gone or where it's emerged from. But if you are shutting down a business, then part of that is about how we communicate with the consumer. So I break this into these 5 sections here. On the first section, we're communicating with the consumer all the time, reminding the consumer that we're doing good work, we're pioneering and developing new products and services. And some of those communications will be about a particular new product. And so you can start to tell the consumer, like, this particular thing's becoming really interesting to us, and it might emerge into something else. And then you move into the section 2. So the first section, you might be doing that for many months before you're ready to start progressing into moving on to the second one, which is starting to shut down old services. So you'll start to tell the consumer in the second section that things might change. This product's coming along. Do you want to partake in, like, being part of the beta testing? Now, the beta testing stuff has been really interesting over the last few years. Many more businesses are doing permanent betas, where they're offering up parts of their new products in the sort of beta fashion. So people have a lot more tolerance to it failing. When we move into the third section, it becomes a lot more accurate. You can't really come back from this section. You have to push on through, right through to the end. So things are changing, giving that specific date and telling customers about what's going to happen when. And then after that, of course, you're into the real change. This is when consumers need to take action. And as you can see at the bottom of this deck, I've put the phases at the end. So these are the periods where the consumer takes action, they observe things changing, and that communication needs to be reinforced. And that's it. In the aftermath, the consumer should be, like, reassured, like, if they've done the right thing, and also, like, reflecting about, like, what went on. And that's the final section. Legal compliance has been really interesting in terms of endings, and there's so much change in the last 15 years around that type of stuff. So we've got not only in terms of physical products, but digital products and service product type endings, which have been legislated for stuff, things around scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, for example. Energy switch guarantees allows the consumers to leave their provider in the UK, to be empowered to do that in an appropriate period of time. Current account switch was a banking piece of legislation in the UK, which allowed people to move from that bank account within 7 days. Previously, it took months to leave bank accounts. CCPA and GDPR doing data protection for individuals in different countries. And there's many of those types of stuff going on all around the world. And lastly, the WE directive, which came in probably about 20 years ago now, but is still, in terms of communication for the consumer, not very legislative, not very. And what's been interesting as well is the amount of certification and laws that have come in. On the physical, social, environmental, social governance, ESG stuff, so these are between 200 and 450 different labels you can get for your company to be certified as, whether it be circularity or scope 3, all of these different things. And it's costing companies ever such a lot of money. So this is stuff from the European Union. They think between 220 to 480,000 a year just to keep that certification. Similarly, in digital, you're getting 2,500 laws around data governance and privacy. And many companies are talking about how that's costing them over $1 million just to keep that up to date every year. And what I find interesting is that this amount of investment isn't getting revealed as a consumer experience to the consumer. What we tend to do is this. We put a symbol on the back of packaging, which to the consumer means nothing. This says, don't throw it in the bin. What do you do if you can't throw it in the bin? What's the other options? What are the things we should be doing? Because when we make symbols this bad or this poor in communication to the consumer feels abandoned and uninstructed. So it compounds that guilty feeling of shame to not know what to do. It also damages your brand when you drop off a cliff of clarity and communication at the end and just legislation comes in, then your brand starts to get eroded really strongly in that point. And that's the place where you want to lay down good memories of good experiences with the consumer to keep your brand equity. Many businesses fail chronically in this. So keeping with legislation a bit, I think it'd be interesting to look at an example of how leaving a consumer experience in digital is a particularly problematic thing in a philosophical sense. So in terms of endings, you have a right to have data portability. If you're starting to share your data with third-party services, you're all thinking about moving on as a consumer. Then you have the right to remove consent, which once consent's removed, then you can't process the data. And obviously right to be forgotten when that's data erased. The problem with proving data erasure is a very old one, and it's called burden of proof. And this one falls into these two categories: the absence of evidence or the evidence of absence. Now, this is how do you prove something isn't there, is essentially what we're doing here. Now, on the left, the consumer often goes for absence of evidence. They believe, I don't see any evidence that you've deleted my stuff, which is a incredibly poor way to come at it, because we can't prove that. But what we need to do in the evidence of absence is tell the consumer clearly about there is currently nothing there. And how do we do that? I think it's worth looking at fine art and other areas to look at this, because these sort of philosophical issues get challenged in those spaces a lot more than we often do in building products. This is the artist Salvatore Garou, I think, and he done this piece of sculpture called La Sono, I Am. And what it is basically a glass box. It's not the glass box, it's the space inside. It's just a piece of absent space. And he argues that this space represents the matter and components and time and that moment it really well, and it represents him. And what it is as a space is nothing. This was recently sold at auction for 16,000 euros. The artist gave the purchaser of that a certificate of authenticity and some instructions about how to do it, how to build this space. Now, this can inform us when we're thinking about, like, how do we design the end in terms of communicating the absence of evidence? So this is the phases of the end, as we were talking about earlier. This is the narrative structure of leaving the consumer experience. So the first thing that happens, the decision to delete. The consumer comes to us as a business and says, I'd like to delete our stuff. So we're at the acknowledge phase. And what we want to do is listen to that consumer, be thoughtful about it, and have a proper ability for them to access that and give us that instruction. And we need to be present there and giving them the impression that we're listening. Because I do endings all the time, I get sent some awful examples of businesses. This is one from the Wall Street Journal. Is if you want to leave the Wall Street Journal, you have to ring up this number, and you can't cancel your subscription from any other method. This is the sort of atrocious stuff which is really bad for your brand and your product, and any level of representation after that. So don't do that. The next one is what we want to move towards. So we've listened, and now we want to provide the consumer with a good way of acknowledging that, so they can feel like they've got agency in doing this offboarding experience, so they can tell us how the end is happening and feel part of that. And I think the one on the right here, now just a minute, I think is a really good way of indicating this. It feels really human, and yet it's asking for something. It's telling you something really explicit about, like, what's going to happen, but it's also asking for a very specific method of approval. After which the consumer would like to witness something. Now, the problem with proving there's nothing there and providing the evidence to show there's nothing there is this really impossible. One thing which I think is in cultural cultural understanding is when you get a 404 error, which I think is really interesting, but probably a bit complicated to give as a consumer experience for this. But what we can do in this space is not necessarily prove that there's nothing there, but we can give give instruction about like what's going to happen. So many services, as you know, if you're going to delete people's data, you're going to have to rewrite over it, and that takes a couple of weeks to do all over your backups as well. And when companies are communicating with consumers on this, they do a really good job in terms of saying, this is what's going to happen. It's going to take 2 weeks for that to happen. So what you're saying isn't necessarily that there's something to be visually seen, but you're observing 2 weeks period while something happens, which sounds a believably technical thing to do. I think one of the things that we could use more of in this space is to lean on the OAuth stuff. And as they're trusted third parties, I think they're impartial enough, at least, to represent us as individuals, as consumers, with the company who's doing the deletion. So there's, I think, an opportunity to get involved with that there. So I guess any technology discussion wouldn't be right without talking about AI. And I was to see recently when Gemini was getting an update and an announcement with an example of sending some products back. And this was them talking about nice to purchase trainers, but if you need to send them back, this is how to do it with AI. The end of the consumer life cycle is a really good place to use AI. At the beginning of the consumer life cycle, your business, if it's using AI, hasn't got as much data about that individual and their context as it would have at the end of offboarding. So you're going to provide a not great onboarding experience, and you're going to build that data up and build that context up with your AI to know a lot more about the consumer as they leave. So you can provide, I think, a really good offboarding experience, and it's a good opportunity for companies. So this could be something like reverse logistics, which was being shown in the Google thing. It could be the sort of follow-ups after somebody's had a service experience where you need to follow up with them to see how that's gone, or especially in sort of healthcare, etc. And lastly, it could be a useful tool for taking people through a very personal experience of data deletion. Okay, so I'm really interested in endings. It's what's one of the most I think funny actually, areas of looking at businesses and seeing them handle endings badly is the lifetime guarantee promise. Now, this has been done by all sorts of sectors and all sorts of businesses, and often silly when you really dig into it. So the first one I wanted to share with you is American Airlines AirPass, and this was a ticket, I guess, a lifetime travel ticket, and it cost $250,000, and this was in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. And somebody looked at this. You can travel on any American Airlines to any destination at any time in any seat. And so there's this guy sitting in Wall Street thinking, wow, that's actually a really good deal. So he gets a couple of these because you can get, a 250 one and then a half price one for your partner. So he got 2 of these tickets. Then he went at it for years. He flew 10,000 different flights, which is a lot of flights, 10 million miles, cost the company 21 million. The CEO of American Airlines said it was the worst business decision they ever made to make these things. Thankfully, they only sold 61 of them. Digital is also guilty of doing this type of thing. So this is Forever. They're a company, and essentially they're offering storage, digital storage, forever plus, or lifetime plus 100 years. I find companies which are really young as well, which, assuming this company's less than 10 years old, they've been doing this. And how can I trust them that they're going to be around for my lifetime plus 100 years? They also offer this fund, this guarantee fund, which will keep your digital assets at a digital technology level. So it will move it from, I don't know, a GIF to PNG, for example. And to do this, you can get a terabyte forever for $7,000. Amazing. VPNs, they do a lifetime guarantee, and the one on the right here. And lifetime guarantee for a VPN usage, considering most people are using VPNs for not legitimate purposes. So like looking at licensed material in other regions when, you know, you want to watch something on Netflix in the US and you live in Sweden, for example, that's what you're using a VPN for, and probably a load worse. But to then promise for a lifetime that you're going to protect that data. And what I find really interesting when you do a lifetime promise is it's a limited guarantee. So you see here that they have a limited time offer. I think that then really disrupts the promise. But this sort of section wouldn't be complete without the lifetime of avoiding death through cryogenics. The promise of that if you die, you can be reborn into a future. And the sales material for this is brilliant. Rebirthed into a future world where you are cured of your time-limiting life. Don't just imagine the world of the future. Personally experience space travel, virtual reality. By the way, virtual reality, by very definition, can be experienced anywhere. It's virtual, and you don't have to spend it in the future, and other incredible things to come. That's the end of the presentation. If you want to become an engineer, start engineering, you can get into the books, buy them on Amazon. There's 100% off Smashwords here. If you photograph this page, you can grab those with those codes. Do company training, individual training. The next one is in January. I'm currently doing one right now. And there's a 25% off one there. And if you're interested in as a business, then I come in and do that and help businesses do the end as well.